On February 28, 2026, all major commercial maritime traffic flowing through the Middle East suddenly and completely stopped. The paralysis centered on the Strait of Hormuz. This corridor typically handles 20 million barrels of oil per day and 20% of the world's supply of LNG. Liquefied natural gas is natural gas cooled to a liquid state for easier shipping. Following joint military strikes by the United States and Israel, Iranian warnings prompted shipping companies to halt all transit. Vessel traffic through the strait reached zero in mid-March. Unlike the oil shocks of the 1970s, which were largely isolated energy supply issues, this disruption immediately impacted global manufacturing, agriculture, and defense through integrated supply chains. Analyzing this crisis requires a framework centered on macroeconomic and systemic failures. We can deconstruct the mechanics of this crisis using two distinct policy frameworks. The first of these is rational choice theory. Rational choice theory posits that actors, whether they are nation-states or corporate insurers, make decisions based on calculated cost-benefit optimization. Decisions are driven by a need to maximize utility rather than by ideology. The second major framework is systems theory. Systems theory models the global economy as a collection of interlinked nodes. A shock to an input in one sector cascades through the entire network. Applying these two theories reveals the Hormuz crisis as a predictable chain reaction of utility calculations. On March 21, 2026, the United States issued an ultimatum demanding the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. The administration threatened to hit Iran's domestic power grid, a move designed to force a rapid recalculation of costs within Tehran's leadership. This threat targeted infrastructure like the Bushehr facility, a primary nuclear energy generator. Disabling this site risked a total blackout for the country's southern grid. Tehran rejected the ultimatum and countered with its own strategy of asymmetric deterrence. The Iranian military threatened to neutralize the power and desalination infrastructure across all Gulf Cooperation Council states, or GCC. The GCC is a political and economic union comprising Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman. Iranian state media published a map of these vulnerable targets, identifying major energy and utility hubs including Saudi Arabia's Samref refinery and Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city. Targeting civilian utilities by both sides is an optimization of deterrence, prioritizing economic pressure over traditional military engagement. The blockade drove Brent crude prices from roughly $70 to over $126 per barrel. The U.S. administration responded by authorizing a release of 400 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. The SPR is a complex of underground salt caverns containing emergency crude oil to mitigate severe supply disruptions. Under rational choice theory, the release provides short-term political utility by stabilizing domestic fuel prices, even as it reduces the long-term energy security provided by the stockpile. However, the math of the disruption is severe. Global demand requires 20 million barrels per day through the Gulf, while bypass pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE can only absorb a maximum of 5.5 million barrels. This leaves a daily shortfall of 15 million barrels. Against this deficit, the world's 1.2 billion barrels in emergency stocks reaches zero in just 73 to 83 days. National vulnerability is unevenly distributed. Countries with smaller stockpile ratios, like India, face economic and political pressure much earlier than nations like Japan or South Korea. These reserves act as an economic clock, determining the maximum timeframe the global market can tolerate the blockade. The state-level standoff is only part of the story. We must also analyze the behavior of private maritime logistics companies. Shipping lines stopped entering the Gulf due to a specific financial catalyst rather than political decrees. War risk insurance premiums for vessels entering the Persian Gulf surged by up to 600% following the initial strikes. This added roughly $250,000 in fees per transit. This cost destroys the profit margin for a standard commercial carrier. The de facto closure of the Strait was ultimately a result of mathematical risk optimization by corporate insurers. Systems theory maps the chain reaction. The loss of Gulf oil disrupts inputs in entirely unrelated global industries. Refining Middle Eastern crude produces a critical industrial byproduct, sulfur. sulfur is necessary for manufacturing artificial fertilizers. The shortage directly impacted global agricultural production, particularly in lower-income nations where farmers rely on imported inputs. This input failure simultaneously chokes the manufacturing of microprocessors and advanced batteries. Analysis from West Point reveals that this supply chain disruption degraded the U.S. defense industry's ability to mass-produce munitions and repair equipment mid-conflict. In a hyperlinked global system, a single chokepoint failure transforms an energy dispute into a crisis of food security and military readiness. The 2026 crisis exposed vulnerabilities that prompted a widespread logistical shift across global manufacturing. It led to the decline of the just-in-time supply chain model. This model involves ordering materials so they arrive only as they are needed for production, minimizing storage costs. Corporations have moved toward a just-in-case model. This approach is characterized by strategic stockpiling and the geographic diversification of suppliers. Building these redundancies creates a more resilient system, but it also raises the baseline cost of production for consumer goods. This geopolitical shock has embedded structural inflation into the global economy, long after military operations have ceased. This crisis has accelerated the urgency of the global energy transition. The extreme volatility of fossil fuel choke points is framing renewable energy as a mandatory component of national security. Future investments in electrification are now driven by a rational choice to achieve energy sovereignty and insulate domestic economies from geopolitical leverage. In an era of hyperconnectivity, kinetic military interventions in the Middle East generate immediate, mathematically predictable feedback loops on global living costs. Understanding the mechanics of these systemic failures is a necessary step for navigating the economic and geopolitical landscape of the coming decade.